So now what we just saw is quite dramatic because Hamas murdered hostages that were supposed to be part of a negotiation. You can't even trust them to respect these people's lives, even when they're supposed to be calling for something that Hamas is going to get. Even in that circumstance, you cannot trust that they have any chance to live. This quite decisively proves that the entire enterprise of negotiations should have never been entered into in the first place.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special edition of Through Conversations podcast, where we explore the truth through conversations with the most brilliant minds. Today with me for a third time on the show is Francisco Gil-White. Francisco, thank you so much for joining me today.
No, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be back.
We are excited to hear you. I know that our community has asked for your third appearance on the show multiple times. I've made sure that I tell you about it. And I'm glad that we're doing this in English because they ask that your content should be shared more in English. So glad to be doing this through this platform. Francisco, today we are recording 2 days after a tragedy that Israel has suffered. 6 of the Israeli hostages were murdered by Hamas. Hersh, Eden, Carmel, Alex, Ori, and Almog. May they rest in peace. And we're thinking with their families and sending our thoughts and our prayers. We're all mourning. Francisco, is this a critical escalation on the conflict? Is this changing the chessboard in terms of how the Israeli government, the international community even, sees the conflict? Will this change the gears towards what we're seeing in terms of the Israel-Iran/Hamas war?
In other words, you're asking me whether the murder of these hostages will cause the so-called international community to shift their stance on whether Israel has a right to defend itself?
Let's tackle that part first, and then we can tackle what would be an appropriate Israeli response.
Okay, I think the answer to that is no, nothing will change. The international community will keep trying to shackle Israel and to find ways to become an obstacle or a restraint to the self-defense of the Israelis. I think that's going to continue just as it has before. There's no reason for it to change because the people who run the world are trying to destroy the Jewish state. Why would 6 hostages change that? In other words, why would 6 murdered hostages change that if 1,200 murdered Israeli civilians and the taking of 250 hostages didn't matter, right? So no, I don't think anything's going to change there.
Oof. And what about the Israeli approach to the war? Because I saw some statements and also a press release by Netanyahu saying, sending reports to the army, asking for plans on how to retaliate towards Hamas. Do you think this will be another escalation also in terms of, the conflict in itself?
Well, I mean, it responds to the murder of these 6 hostages would not be an escalation. It would be a response. One that I think is long overdue. I mean, so it's not as if we needed these 6 hostages to justify a vigorous and decisive Israeli response that would cause Israel to quickly win this war and utterly defeat its genocidal enemy. We had ample justification on October 7th. And in fact, we had it before October 7th. So, no, I think that there's no way that anything, I mean, there's almost nothing that Israel can do that would really deserve to be called an escalation. I mean, How can that word even be used in this context? The state of Israel, the Jewish state, was attacked by genocidal terrorists who announced in their own constitution that their goal, their express goal, is the extermination of the Jewish people. How? And they were attacked. They attacked, murdered, tortured to death countless civilians. Took 250 hostages. Nothing that Israel does practically could be called an escalation. But even so, Israel has been very careful. No army in the world is more careful than the Israeli Defense Forces, protecting the lives of their enemies. And these happen to be genocidal enemies of their enemy civilians, So the fact that the word escalation is used so consistently to describe Israeli behavior, I think, is in itself quite revealing of the anti-Semitic framework in which all media communications take place. It's as if there were this technology called the anti-Semitic filter, so that every time somebody spoke, whatever they said would come out the other side with a structure, with a verbal and grammatical structure that makes it always the Jews are bad. Every single expression has to have that semantic and grammatical structure. It's really quite amazing. Quite amazing. There is really nothing that the enemies of Israel can do that will be sufficient to turn this around, because the filter is always operating. So now what we just saw is quite dramatic, because Hamas murdered hostages that were supposed to be part of a negotiation. So you can't even trust them to respect these people's lives, even when they're supposed to be calling for something that Hamas is going to get. Even in that circumstance, you cannot trust that they have any chance to live. And so what would be the argument against conducting any more negotiations with Hamas? I think this quite decisively proves that the entire enterprise of negotiations should have never been entered into in the first place.
So, if I'm understanding correctly, Francisco, you're saying that the approach towards getting back the hostages shouldn't be through negotiations. How should the Israeli government try to get them through operations, through getting them militarily speaking? What would have been the appropriate
If the Israeli government had been very worried about hostages and also worried about getting them back, it would have behaved completely differently from the way it behaved. So the first thing the Israeli government should have done is protect the Gaza border. The Gaza border was obviously unprotected. Thousands of Hamas terrorists just rolled across the Gaza fence and started murdering Israeli civilians, and practically nobody came to help them, right? The Israeli army and the police, everybody, they were all absent for hours and hours and hours and hours on end, while these people were playing with the bodies of Israeli Jewish civilians, toying with their bodies, torturing them to death. No presence of the Israeli authorities for hours. So what would the Israeli government have done if they cared about the lives of these hostages? Well, first of all, even if I were to overlook the fact that the Gaza border was unprotected and that no soldiers were nearby to react to an emergency, right? Even if I overlooked those two very suspicious facts and chalk that up to just, negligence or stupidity or some halfway innocent explanation, there would still be the problem of explaining why no helicopters or airplanes flew to where those hostages were being murdered slowly, tortured to death during all those hours, because that didn't happen. And the next question is, why weren't any helicopters or planes flown to the no man's land between the last kibbutz and the Gaza fence, right? And why didn't they station those? They could have bombed the trench to keep the Gaza terrorists from coming back to Gaza, and they could have faced them and prevented them from taking the hostages in. That was not even attempted. So what should the government do? Well, the government should try to get the hostages, and of course militarily is the right way to do that. Because if you negotiate for the hostages' lives, then what you are doing is you're collaborating with Yahya Sinwar. You become a collaborator with Yahya Sinwar, because that was Yahya Sinwar's plan all along. It's obvious. It's obvious. These people understand what's going to happen. If they take hostages, the Israeli public is going to be divided down the middle over the question of whether to negotiate or not to negotiate. He knows that's going to happen, and that's why he did it. Because he wanted that fight. So if you negotiate, you play right into his hands, and you can't really trust that you're going to get what you're negotiating for, because these people are anti-Semitic, genocidal terrorists whose ultimate goal is to see every last living Jew destroyed. So clearly the best thing that Yahya Sinwar can do to divide Israeli society into bitterly opposed camps, which is very good for him, right? That's not good for the Israelis. That's good for Yahya Sinwar. So the best he can do is he can pretend to enter negotiations, and in the middle of those negotiations, kill some hostages. And that will make the opposing camps become even more bitterly opposed. So Yahya Sinwar is having success so far in moving Israelis closer to a civil war, which is, of course, what was going on right before October 7th happened. And I think in that particular juncture, I think Hamas miscalculated. They thought that the October 7th attack would tip Israelis into a civil war, and then they would be invaded by everybody. This is why they were so upset. Nobody else attacked. Right, because I think the plan was we'll massacre. I don't think they meant to have such a gigantic attack. I think they meant to massacre a few Israelis, take a lot of hostages, right? But not kill 1,200 people. I don't think that was the plan. I think these monsters just went out of control. It was too easy to kill Jews, and they couldn't stop themselves, right? And so the effect of the gigantic slaughter, genocidal slaughter, was that it unified Israelis. It had the opposite effect. But now Yahya Sinwar is fixing his mistake. Now he's adapting. He's realizing what he needs to do. And he is once again producing the kind of moves that may eventually result in an Israeli civil war, which of course would mean the destruction of Israel. So anybody cooperating with this policy of Yahya Sinwar's is collaborating with the enemy. Entering negotiations is precisely that. If you really care about protecting Israelis, instead of collaborating with Hamas, the first thing you would do is you would take the Egypt-Gaza border. I mean, why? It's the last thing they did. There were 150 tunnels just in the Philadelphia corridor joining Egypt to Gaza. So not taking the Egypt-Gaza border is collaborating with the enemy. What else would you call it? What is the responsibility of the Israeli government supposed to be? It's supposed to be to defend ordinary Israelis. How do you do that? You remove the tunnels that connect Gaza with Egypt because obviously weapons and hostages and everything, terrorists moved through those tunnels. Nope. It's the last thing they did. So, there are many things that the Israeli government could have done and should have done and should now do to try and protect Israelis, including those hostages. It has done almost everything wrong. But the one thing it should not do and should have never done, not even discussed doing, is negotiate with the hostages. And it should have explained to the Israeli public why. It should have explained to the Israeli public that the reason October 7th happened, and of course the Israeli government has great powers of communication, that the prime minister can have a very serious press conference or TV address in which he explains that they were mistaken before, that they made a great mistake when they exchanged, I think, something like 1,000 terrorists to free one Israeli soldier, effectively using Hamas's human shields policy. Because those terrorists are going to murder Israeli civilians. That's what they're for. And so the soldier's life was ransomed with the lives of all those civilians that those terrorists later killed. And guess what? That includes the 1,200 civilians that were killed on October 7th, because Yehya Sinwar was, and others who organized October 7th were liberated in that exchange. So the prime minister of Israel, with the responsibility to protect the lives of Israelis, should have said, look, we made a gigantic mistake. We should have never done that. But we've learned our lesson. And never again will we negotiate with terrorists. Because when you negotiate with terrorists, you whet their appetite. You give them something for their terror, and that teaches them that terror pays. You give them something for their hostages, and that teaches them that taking hostages pays. So he should have said, we made a very, very great mistake, but we will be responsible now with the lives of the Israelis. And from now on, we really are going to protect Israelis. And for that reason, we will never again negotiate with terrorists, because we have to protect the Israelis of today and the Israelis of the future. Otherwise, the Jewish state makes no sense. It's for the future. So that's what he should have done. He didn't do that, and he didn't change the policy, and he didn't do a million things that he should have done to prevent this from happening and to react properly when it did happen. It's a real shame.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the last time a deal happened, you just pointed it out, was in 2011, where 1,027 terrorists, who were collectively responsible for 569 Israeli deaths, were released from war for one person, like you said, and that includes Sinwar, the mastermind behind the nightmare of the war that's happening now.
So Sinwar has been ransomed twice this way? Twice?
I don't know. I think it's the only one, the 2011.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, because Gilad Shalit was not on 2011.
I think that was 2014. So I might have the facts wrong. We can check them later. But
anyway, the point is the same. But the point is the same because what you're right. This hasn't happened. It wasn't just with Gilad Shalit. They've been doing this. There's been a whole tradition of this. They've been doing it for decades. And it's amazing that the Israeli public doesn't learn that this, in fact, amounts to collaboration with the enemy. They should not allow this. This was also done as part of the Oslo process. So in exchange for the Oslo signature, which never meant anything, Pilo Fatah, what we now call the Palestinian Authority, was rewarded with the release of a multitude of terrorists from Israeli jails.
Yeah.
And they went and became the security forces of the Palestinian Authority.
Yeah. It's the same one, Francisco. Yeah, 2011 was Sinwar for Gilad Shalit. It was the
Okay.
same one.
It's the same one.
Yeah. There's a lot to cover there, and I'm hearing you and your rationale and the motives behind not negotiating makes sense. But at the same time, I feel the sorrow and the frustration of all those who were marching yesterday and have been marching since the hostages were taken. I think it was the last figure I saw throughout these 2 days, and including today, the Ben Gurion airport was effectively shut down for, I think, 4 hours or so. It's difficult because you say on one hand, let's protect Israel for the future, for future generations. But at the same time, Israelis are kept without them being able to exit the horrors of Hamas. They're still there. So, politically speaking, it's creating the turmoil that you're saying in Israel, the protests and everything, and it's just hard to reconcile.
Politics does not happen to leaders. Leaders make politics. If the Prime Minister of Israel were a leader, a true leader, he would have explained what I just told you to Israelis. He would have said, look, we made a terrible mistake and this is what happened. And I take responsibility. But I will never do this again, because that would be to endanger the lives of all Israelis, and not just Israelis, but Jews everywhere. Terrorists are learning that it pays to hurt Jews anywhere. So no. Politics doesn't happen to leaders. Leaders make politics. Netanyahu should have changed the conversation so that people would not be confused about what is moral. Now, of course, I understand the emotions. Obviously, my heart goes out to everyone who's worried about the hostages. I'm worried about the hostages. I feel the same emotions. The people who are arguing for not negotiating with the hostages are suffering for the hostages too. This is not a question of whether you care for the hostages or not. It's not a question of whether the fate of the hostages makes you suffer or not, gives you pain or not. That's not the issue. We're all suffering for the hostages, please. All of us. The question is, what is ethical behavior at this juncture? And emotions are not the same thing as ethics. If somebody is dying and you need to amputate their leg, for example, you're going to feel a horrible emotion removing that leg. It's going to feel horrible, but that doesn't mean it's not ethical to perform a medical emergency, right? It's ethical. You have to try to save the person, right? In this particular case, what is ethical? We've seen that negotiating with hostages, negotiating for the lives of hostages has produced more deaths and more hostages. Given that is true, how could it be ethical to engage in a behavior that you know is going to produce more deaths and more hostages? That's the definition of unethical behavior. That doesn't mean you don't suffer for the hostages that are already taken. Of course you do. And if you have soldiers, which Israel does, they should be looking for them. Of course. Of course. And I do think soldiers' lives should be risked to try and save the hostages. That is the right way to do things, because the function of a professional soldier is to protect the lives of innocent citizens. That is the function, the official bureaucratic defense function of a soldier. What is not correct is to defend the life of a soldier with the life of a citizen. That is upside down. That is what we call the human shields policy. And when Hamas does it, we condemn them correctly, justly, because the human shields policy is unethical. It is immoral. But when the state of Israel, what the state of Israel did in the case of Gilad Shalit was upside down. They were defending the lives of a soldier with the lives of citizens. That's a human shields policy. They're not doing it in the exact same way. Everything is not simultaneous, but the terrorists you are releasing to save that one soldier are going to kill civilians. That's guaranteed. That's what they do, right? So you're actually exchanging civilian lives to save a soldier. That's upside down. That's unethical. It's unethical. And once again, here, that to collaborate with Sinwar's strategy, which is what negotiating for hostages is, amounts to making Hamas stronger. And what is Hamas about? Murdering Israeli civilians. No. What you have to do is weaken Hamas. That is what's ethical, because Hamas's goal is the genocide of the Jewish people. So nothing that amounts to collaboration with Hamas's strategy can possibly be ethical.
If Netanyahu's approach when October 7th happened, right then on, until this point, almost a year later, has he managed the war effectively, or has he failed as a leader?
Well, no. I don't believe he's done almost nothing right. I mean,
how so?
He should have won that war in 2 weeks. What are you talking about? And when Hezbollah gives him an opportunity to produce a massive attack and reduce them to ashes, or Iran gives him a perfect opportunity to go ahead and destroy their military infrastructure, he doesn't do it.
Do you think it was possible?
He needs to. These are enemies that have announced their intention to commit genocide, to abolish the state of Israel from the face of the earth, to burn it. And they have given Netanyahu multiple opportunities, multiple excuses that Netanyahu could have used to destroy their military capability and thereby defend Israeli lives. I don't see Netanyahu pursuing any kind of strategy that is designed to save Israeli lives. I see him pursuing a strategy that might have been designed by the enemies of Israel, because we see the enemies of Israel attack Israel, and then Israel debates whether it should respond. And then when it does respond, it responds very timidly. In Gaza, we see, first of all, it took forever to start attacking Gaza, to respond to what happened on October 7th, which shouldn't have ever happened anyway, right? It took forever to start responding to that. And then they did it very slowly, and they didn't rush to take the Gaza-Egypt border first. I can see almost nothing right. I mean, and look, what we have right now is Hezbollah just gave Israel another fantastic excuse to go reduce them to ashes. And once again, it didn't happen. And what we have is these low-level attacks that the Israeli public, I guess, and the world is now they've been accustomed to accept this as normal. That it's normal, that it's okay for the genocidal of enemies of Israel to once in a while lob a few rockets at Israeli civilians. This is acceptable. And what this is doing now is that it's effectively reducing the territory of the state of Israel. It amounts to an invasion because Israeli civilians right now cannot live in the north of Israel. How is this possible to be tolerated? The entire military strategy looks like what Hezbollah would want or Iran would want, right? Maybe not Hamas. Hamas, in spite of everything, is being reduced, right? But it's not being reduced the way it should have been. There are many aspects of the way that Israel has fought Hamas that make it relatively easy for Hamas to return, when what we should be seeing is the utter destruction of Hamas.
Well, surely there's been accomplishments done throughout this year. Of course, not total, but you were.
Well, I think that the soldiers have fought very well. I mean, there is no question that the just professionalism and ingenuity and just fighting spirit of the Israeli soldiers is just unbelievable. Unbelievable. And the war would have been over in 2 weeks if they had let them fight properly. But you're right. There's no question that many tactical objectives have been achieved in Gaza thanks to the amazing fighting ability of the Israeli soldiers. But you can't say the strategy has been very good. I mean, the fact that we're still fighting in Gaza after 1 year is unbelievable. It's unbelievable.
That is mind-blowing. But also the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Iran, how that happened. We're referring not to Sinwar, but Sinwar wasn't the lead before. Of course, he was part of it, but the head was Ismail Haniyeh. I don't know if I'm saying that right. And that turn of events where they actually went into Iran through Mossad and detonated a bomb in the room. It's intel, like it's a hell of intel. It's just another level. But on the other hand, it also hinted towards a very possible World War III. Like last time we spoke, we discussed the escalation with Iran, sending I don't know how many, like hundreds of rockets at the same time and drones. Then this one, the assassination of Haniyeh in Iran's soil, would have been the next obvious escalation. And then the attack was through Hezbollah, and they haven't attacked yet Iran.
I would enjoin you to stop using the word escalation to refer to Israeli acts of self-defense. Right. If the government of Israel killed Ismail Haniyeh, Haniyeh had it coming. That's not an escalation. Haniyeh launched an act of genocidal war. Therefore, killing Haniyeh is not an escalation. I mean, if anything, it's compassionate to Haniyeh. He deserved far worse, right? They just killed him. It was relatively quick. Much better than what the Israeli civilians got on October 7th, right? He got a quick death. So that's not an escalation. That's a mercy killing for Haniyeh. He was treated with great respect compared to what he deserved. So no, these are not escalations. And I think, as I said before, that, but the responses that Israel has had against Iran have been very, very tepid. I mean, very tepid. And what is this business about World War III? I mean, why are people worried about World War III? So this is just a narrative. It's a narrative. They talk about regional war. They talk about World War III. These are just narratives meant to give people an argument for why Israel should not defend itself. That's what it is. That's what it is.
Well, if Iran would have retaliated, that would have created a possible scenario where there is just an all-out war, not through proxies, not through Hezbollah. It would have been a much different conversation. And it's still, it's still slow boiling, that possibility, no?
Well, that war is coming sooner or later. So should you wait until your enemies are stronger? Would that make sense? If the war is coming anyway, what would be the argument for waiting? On the contrary, when your enemies are weak, go ahead and win the war, because it's coming either way. It's not like Turkey, the government of Turkey, Erdogan, is not interested in the destruction of Israel. Of course he's interested in the destruction of Israel. That's what he wants. He's Muslim Brotherhood. He's allied with the Muslim Brotherhood, right? It's not like Qatar doesn't want the destruction of Israel. It's not like Iran doesn't want it, or Syria, or Lebanon, or Gaza, or Egypt. They all want it. Why does Egypt have 150 tunnels connecting it to Gaza? Didn't they sign a peace treaty back in, 1979? They signed a peace treaty with Israel. So I guess that's why they have 150 tunnels just in the Philadelphia corridor, connecting them with the anti-Semitic genocidal terrorists who are sworn to destroy Israel. It must be because they're honoring the peace treaty that they signed in 1979. They all want the destruction of Israel. The war is coming. So the whole World War III, blah, 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 the bigger war, it's coming anyway. Might as well have it out when your enemies are still weak. This is the moment. So this idea that you're in danger of triggering a bigger war is just another narrative. That bigger war has always been going on. Sometimes it's cold, sometimes it's hot. But these people are always plotting and maneuvering and preparing for the destruction of Israel. They've already launched several genocidal wars against the state of Israel. And they launched another one on October 7th. And it's going to keep coming. I mean, how many wars does it take? How many announced, declared genocidal wars by the various Arab states are needed to convince people that the Arab states will not stop unless utterly defeated?
Well, I think the goal is to never have that all-out war, that it's a narrative, like you say. But on the other hand, you mentioned October 7th, and of course this is what the biggest, I want to say, escalation, but on the other, like from the other side of the equation of the Israeli side.
The other side does escalate. Certainly.
Right.
Certainly.
It's been almost a year, like what we've discussed. It's been a year of this back and forth, this rise of anti-Semitism, the rise of hatred, the rise of, seeing even in Washington, D.C., posters saying kill all Israelis, kill all Jews, they control the world, all of that. It's been a year of that. How much longer? Like, because it hasn't really, the situation hasn't really cooled down. It's been just going on.
Well, look, if the Jews control the world, they are doing a very bad job of using everything that they control to protect themselves, right? I mean, so the Jews control the world, but they can't stop puny Hamas. They can't stop Hamas. What? Hamas is nothing. And the state of Israel, which allegedly, the Jews, which allegedly control the world, they can't stop Hamas from murdering Israeli civilians? Come on. I mean, are people using their heads?
Francisco, it's been a year. How much longer did you foresee when this first happened? Of course, you mentioned 2 weeks. They could have finished this in 2 weeks. But 2 weeks have passed almost a year now. Do you see this coming into play yet another year? Will we see 2 years of this, 3 years of this war? Or do you see a way out in terms of, let's try to consolidate what happened. Let's try to just end the war altogether, at least this chapter of it.
So one thing that could change the course of the war, make it shorter, give Israel a better chance to survive, would be for a political revolt to happen in Israel. So if Israelis could unite instead of divide, if they could unite around the obvious evidence that their leadership has failed, or it has succeeded. It all depends on how you interpret what their intentions are, right? Maybe they have succeeded, but either way, they have to be removed. Because whatever their true intentions, they're disastrous. They're getting all kinds of Israelis killed. Israelis can no longer live in the north of Israel. October 7th, of course, should have never happened. So these people have to be removed from power. So if the Israelis can unite around that enlightenment, and vote in a completely different set of leaders with a proper understanding of what has happened, because Israelis still don't know what has happened. They still don't understand the Oslo process. They need to see the historical structure of what happened to them so that they can have the proper search image for the kind of leader that they now need. And they need to know what those leaders' policies have to be in light of what the actual structure of the world is. So if that can happen, then everything can change. If that doesn't happen, if the leadership that has been running Israel pretty much from the beginning of the creation of the state, with some notable exceptions, chief among them Menachem Begin, if that leadership remains in power, we can expect more of the same. Because whether they are succeeding in a very nefarious goal or just failing miserably at defending Israel, either or, they're going to cause the destruction of the state of Israel.
Francisco, how would that new leadership, how would you see them lead the way? Like, let's say they do remove this Netanyahu and all of the government body. How would they lead? What would be the right policy taken in place?
Oh, well, that's obvious. They need to utterly defeat the terrorist organizations. And so that means killing or expelling all of the terrorists who resist arrest, right? Anybody shooting at Israelis, you either kill or if you can imprison them, but if they're shooting at you, you shoot back and you defeat them. They're terrorists. There's no reason to tolerate them inside the Jewish state. Like any state, Israel should get rid of any terrorists inside the territory of the Jewish state. So that's what you do. That's step one. You get rid of the terrorists. And then you protect both Arab Palestinians and Israeli Jews over the entire territory by establishing a military government in the areas that are dangerous. And you take over all of the institutions. What else are you going to do? The institutions that the Arab Palestinians have right now have been teaching them from the age of 3 and 4. They learned this in kindergarten, to hate Jews and to kill Jews. Right? This is what they learn in school. This is what they learn in TV. You can't have that. That's not tolerable. So you have to take over the institutions. So that you can protect the minds of Arab Palestinians from being poisoned again with this garbage, and you're going to have to be a custodian for the next Arab Palestinian generation. You know, you're going to have to govern them for 50 years at least, because you need to protect the new minds from being poisoned by the people who are irredeemable. Right? You need to protect the next generation of Arab Palestinians from being reared in Mordor. Right? You have to protect them. So that's what you do. You do what a responsible government does. There's no mystery. You protect the civilian population of your country, whether they are Arab Palestinian or Israeli Jews. You protect them all. And the way you protect them all is by making sure that there are no terrorists there oppressing them. That's what you do. It's not rocket science. It's just that the people running the state of Israel are not quality people.
Wouldn't be an argument in favor of a 1-year war, a 2-year war, a 3-year war to completely dismantle the terrorist network? It cannot be done in less than a month. This is a complex.
Well, that's what they're teaching you, you see. That's what they're teaching you. They're teaching you that this cannot be done quickly because they've taken so long. So how much longer would it take? You see, it's a false argument. It's taken this long because of the way they've been fighting. It doesn't need to take this long. Just like October 7th didn't need to happen. The border didn't need to be breached.
Well, Francisco, the other side of it is human shields. Like the whole Gaza military structure by Hamas is blended with civilians. So it's kind of like an impossible task to eliminate all without the proper necessary humanitarian restrictions of,
That's not true. That's not true. Israel has a better record, a better ratio of civilian to military casualties than any other army in history, even though it is fighting a more difficult enemy than anyone else has fought in this particular dimension, right? So no urban warfare has been more difficult in terms of protecting enemy civilian lives than Israel's operations in Gaza. And still, Israel has a much better ratio than any other army in history fighting urban warfare. Therefore, it's not true that you can't try very hard to protect these people. The Israeli army, the Israeli Defense Forces are doing that. There are still going to be some civilian casualties, but those are not your fault. Those are Hamas's fault. It is not the responsibility of the state of Israel to save every last Arab civilian. Their responsibility is to protect the lives of Israeli civilians. That doesn't mean that the IDF should not be careful and try to avoid civilian casualties on the enemy side. They should. That's ethical, and they do it. But their primary responsibility is not the lives of the Arab Palestinians. Their primary responsibility, because they are the state of Israel, not the state of Gaza, is the protecting the lives of Israeli civilians. And every member of every nation in the world knows this. This is obvious. People only change the argument when it is the Jews defending themselves.
No,
of course, to take the position that any civilian casualties in Gaza mean that Israel is not doing it right, which is what we always hear. In addition to the fact that the figures for alleged civilian casualties in Gaza are always the figures that Hamas gives, which of course nobody can confirm and nobody should believe. Why would you believe it? All of that is just more anti-Semitism. It's more Judeophobia. It's Jew hatred. It's all it is. It's so obvious. I mean, it's unbelievably obvious. It's just transparent.
Francisco, another pivot that's coming soon, in about 2 months, is the U.S. presidential election. Now, Joe Biden has stepped down. Kamala Harris is coming in as a candidate. I've read her policies towards Israel, hinting a bad relationship, political relationship and international relationship with Israel. And then there's Donald Trump, who a lot of people are saying they're not gonna they're not going to allow Donald Trump to be elected president. But that's a whole conversation, a different one in itself. How do you see the U.S. presidential election affecting, if in any way, the Israel-Hamas, Israel-Iran war, and frankly, the whole region, the future of it?
Well, see, we have to start from the understanding that I don't believe there are two parties in the United States, not at that level. So Biden, Trump, Obama, Kamala, Bush, they're all the same. I don't think there's any real substantive difference. I think that the presentation of the candidates is part of the game, of the management of reality, as I call it. Because in order to keep people asleep, they have to believe they're in a democracy. So you have to give them candidates that they're going to get excited about and that they're going to go vote against or vote for. The more you can do this, the more you can obscure the fact that, in fact, there is no choice. There's no choice. I mean, all you have to do is look at the foreign policy of the United States in the Middle East for the last, well, ever since World War II. It's been perfectly consistent. And it's been anti-Israeli. So, I mean, people ask, people need to see like a pattern. And of course, the pattern is there. It's very clear. But I like to think in terms of dramatic facts. I don't mind patterns, but the dramatic facts are very nice, because a dramatic fact is a fact that under the hypothesis you were considering is impossible. Okay? So you have a hypothesis, and that hypothesis says this X cannot happen. The structure of the hypothesis makes that impossible. So if the hypothesis is true, you would never be able to document X, right? That's a dramatic fact. So what happens when you document X? Well, fantastic. Now you know that your hypothesis is false. You just needed one fact. You're done. Because that fact is impossible under your hypothesis. So you don't need to do any more. You don't need to sweat to keep refuting the hypothesis. You're done. So if your hypothesis is that the people running the U.S. government, the U.S. bosses, are friends of Israel, so your hypothesis is, well, they want to protect the Israeli security. They want to help Israel have strong borders, be stronger than its enemies, be able to defend itself, all that kind of stuff. If that's your hypothesis, or even stronger, if your hypothesis, because many people go to this extreme, that, the entire foreign policy of the United States is done to protect the state of Israel, right? If you have a hypothesis like that, then the Oslo process can't happen. That's a dramatic fact. Because what the U.S. government did with the Oslo process is that it created a diplomatic initiative, the purpose of which was to bully Israel into accepting into militarily strategic territory of the Jewish state a genocidal terrorist organization created by Haj Amin al-Husseini, the founding father of the Arab-Palestinian movement, who is also the co-architect of the German Nazi final solution. And moreover, PLO Fatah, this organization that Haj Amin al-Husseini created, and which we now call the Palestinian Authority, this PLO Fatah not only descends from the German Nazi final solution, but is the creator of jihadi Iran, because they trained and armed Ayatollah Khomeini's guerrillas that fought the Iranian Islamic Revolution, that installed Ayatollah Khomeini in power. And after he was installed in power, Arafat and Abbas were flown over to Tehran with other PLO stalwarts, and they assisted the creation of the key Iranian institutions of the Islamic Republic, and together Arafat and Khomeini promised that they would work together to destroy the state of Israel. So that is PLO Fatah. That is the organization that the U.S. bosses forced into the Jewish state to give it militarily strategic territory. The spawn of the German Nazi final solution and the daddy of would-be genocidal Iran. That's it. We're done. Under any kind of hypothesis that the people running the United States are in any way, to any degree, friends of Israel, that can't happen. That's impossible. But that did happen, which means that U.S. bosses are trying to destroy Israel.
How does that, Francisco, come into play in 2024 with Kamala and Donald Trump? Because surely they will have different policies towards Israel, at least in the explicit. And at the same time, I saw a map with all of the U.S. naval ships that are surrounding the Middle East in almost Israel, like the entirety of, I think it was the USS Eisenhower, like the big ships are surrounding the Middle East, implying that there is support towards Israel. So how does that come into play?
Well, that is implied only in the universe where the Oslo process didn't happen. In a universe where the Oslo process did happen, you already know that U.S. bosses are trying to destroy Israel. Therefore, logically, the interpretation you have to give to those ships is not that those ships are there to defend Israel. Those ships are there to make sure that there is no provocation against Israel sufficiently large that would make it impossible to restrain Israel from destroying the enemy that provoked it. Those ships are there to make sure that Hezbollah and Iran and Turkey and whomever, Egypt, don't accidentally get too excited and launch an attack that would cause Israeli public opinion to demand that enemy be destroyed. What those ships are doing is protecting the enemies of Israel from an Israeli counterattack. It is keeping things quiet for now so that the conditions for an Israeli decisive victory are not created. Do you follow?
I do.
If those ships were not there, one of those Arab hotheads might get a head that is too hot. Too many missiles might flow from Hezbollah and Lebanon, or from Egypt, from any of these, of Saudi Arabia, who knows? Any of these enemies, right? One of them might get a head that is too hot. Iran, of course. Could be Iran, right? And if that happens, and Israel is then cornered into a position in which even the current leaders of Israel would have to respond decisively, because otherwise they would be lynched, right? If that situation developed, then the entire chess play to destroy the state of Israel might be ruined. So the U.S. bosses have to be careful to keep things relatively quiet, because the enemies of Israel are not yet ready to destroy Israel. They would be ready if Israel were to fall into a civil war. And that's what they thought was going to happen on October 7th. But the attack was too large. The civil war did not happen. The opposite happened. Israelis were united. And that, in my opinion, is why they didn't all attack at once. Remember, Hamas was notably surprised and upset that others had not joined their attack on October 7th. They were very upset. Very upset. Astonished. How come they left us fighting alone? How can they? Where are they? This was the immediate complaint. I believe that the original plan was take a lot of hostages. Don't massacre 1,200 civilians. Torture them to death. Play with the breasts of women. None of that, I believe, was the plan. The plan was to take a lot of hostages because the history shows that when you take hostages, that is a really great way of dividing Israeli society. Because half of Israel will say you must negotiate, and the other half will say never negotiate. And on October 6th, those two sides of Israel were already on the verge of a civil war. It seemed. At least that was Hamas's and everybody else's calculation, right? That's what I think. So, but the Hamas fighters got out of control. They're terrorists. They got out of control. They're cannibals. So the attack became so horrific that it had the opposite effect of what was planned. And so instead of producing a civil war, it united Israelis, and then the other guys were afraid. They're like, uh-oh, there's no civil war in Israel. Do we still want an attack? And they didn't attack. You see, they're not ready yet. Not unless there is a civil war in Israel. That's the only condition in which they feel ready to destroy it. So now that the civil war didn't happen, or it hasn't happened yet, what the U.S. bosses are doing is they're trying to prevent another miscalculation like the one that happened on October 7th. Because if another such miscalculation happens, they might lose another chess piece. You see, they're losing Hamas, which was kind of important. They needed it. And they might lose Hezbollah. They're worried. So the ships are there to make sure that nobody moves so much that Israel would then, by the nature of its internal politics, be forced to then take another piece out of the map. This is a very delicate process. It's a very delicate process because reality is being managed. So you have to seem like you're defending Israel at the same time that you protect the process that will eventually destroy it. But you can't destroy it yourself. The U.S. can't go and drop an atomic bomb on Israel because that would produce a revolution in the United States. You see? It has to be someone else. And they already did this. They did this in World War II. In World War II, the German Nazis did the direct job of murdering the European Jews. But the people that had produced the German Nazis were the eugenicists. And the eugenicists were in the United States. The biggest leaders of the eugenics movement were the great industrial leaders of the United States. The bosses, the industrial bosses, the people like the Rockefellers, Carnegie, Ford, Thomas Watson from IBM. These were the people who were financing the eugenics movement that in Germany became German Nazism. They were sending money to Germany to get this done. This has all been documented by historian Edwin Black in War Against the Weak, published in 2003. He rescued that whole topic from oblivion. It was not exactly a secret, but it was not getting discussed in schools. Nobody learns about eugenics properly in school. Most people have never heard the word, right? Guess why? Guess why? Because once you understand eugenics, it becomes obvious that it was the U.S. bosses that were murdering the European Jews. They just did it by proxy. This whole period that they call appeasement is not appeasement. Appeasement was promotion. Who's the poster child for appeasement? Isn't it Neville Chamberlain, Prime Minister of Britain, inaugurated in 1937? Right? He's the poster child for appeasement. Well, It was documented a long time ago by mainstream historians writing in the best historical journals, Cambridge, Oxford. It was documented in the 1980s that Neville Chamberlain was a Nazi. That's not an adjective. He was a eugenicist, and he was in love with Adolf Hitler. And he controlled, through his best friend Joseph Ball, he controlled the entire British press. But in particular, one newspaper, which was called Truth, was his personal property because he had bought it through a what do you call it? Prestanombres, through a proxy. He had bought it through a proxy, right? So it was his own newspaper. And Truth published nothing but defenses of Adolf Hitler's foreign policy and criticisms of the enemies of Hitler, and it celebrated Hitler's obviously fake promises of peace and so forth, and it even praised Hitler's as a great watercolor artist. All of this was published in the newspaper that Neville Chamberlain personally owned. And he recommended this to his sisters, and he was very proud. This guy was pro-Nazi. Appeasement was not appeasement. They were look, the Conservative Party at the time was full of this. Neville Chamberlain was not atypical. The Conservative Party, which was where the aristocracy, the British aristocracy, flocked, not all of them, but many of them, it was full of pro-Nazi sentiment. Look, Edward VIII, the king of Great Britain, Edward VIII was completely besotted with Adolf Hitler, and that is famous. That is famous. It's infamous. But he was not atypical. It was a symptom of the whole system. So these people, this Anglo-American conspiracy, the eugenicists, they're still in power. Nobody removed them. So these people had, they created eugenics. They produced German Nazism. The Nazis killed the European Jews. Well, if it worked once, and if nobody understands it, because this is not being properly taught in schools and in universities, right? So nobody understands what they did. Why not just do the same thing again? So now they created Iran. What could be more obvious? We had a whole scandal in the 1980s called Iran-Contra, didn't we? And we found that Ronald Reagan, the Republican president, had been sending billions of dollars a year in armament to Ayatollah Khomeini, the very guy that he called his worst enemy in the world, the guy around whom he had built his entire presidential campaign. He was going to show Khomeini Carter was a weakling. He was going to put Khomeini in his place. Iran would see, blah, blah, blah. The minute they elected Reagan president, he started sending billions of dollars in secret weapons to Iran. When they caught him, he said, "Oh yeah, I was trying to free some hostages that Hezbollah had captured in Lebanon, in Beirut. And because Khomeini is Hezbollah's daddy, we thought maybe if we sent them billions of weapons, we could beg him to, influence Hezbollah to release 6 hostages or however many they had." You see, they always fool us with hostages. But it couldn't. It was obviously absurd. You don't send billions of weapons to your worst enemy, who has vowed publicly to destroy your country and has created a terrorist nightmare in Iran. You don't send that guy billions of dollars in weapons a year because you want him to release a few hostages in Lebanon. That is insane. Obviously, that was not the reason. But later, there was several investigations, in fact, proved that it couldn't be the reason, because the first secret arms transfers for Khomeini began in 1981, and the first hostage was taken in 1982. So obviously, the decision to start sending weapons to Khomeini had nothing to do with any hostages, right? So this is evidence that they've been creating Iran the way they created German Nazism, right? They've been They've been building up Iran. Notice they never invaded Iran. They invaded Iraq. It was Iran's rival. They took Iran's rival off the chessboard, which then caused Iran to inherit Iraq and gave Iran a land corridor all the way to the northern border of Israel. My God, if you just look at the facts, it's not that hard to put together. It just isn't. But people are mesmerized by the show, you see. And you can understand it. I mean, people don't, it's the hypothesis that the entire media system is creating a managed reality that is turning the world upside down sounds crazy. And most people don't have the time to do historical research. But when you do it, it's really impossible to miss. I mean, unless you really are caught inside an ideology that doesn't allow you to consider alternative hypotheses to the one that the mainstream sources of authority are treating like the obvious truth, you know?
Francisco, that was a masterclass of history, that last intervention. You go more in depth into it in our first conversation, so I will put the notes into that first one in the episode notes. And I think we should start wrapping up, Francisco, with, the last 2 times that I spoke with you, your position was Israel will fall, and if Israel falls, the West is next. I want an update on that statement. Is that the same mindset that you have now, or has it changed to a more optimistic version of it?
Well, I mean, optimism is a question of, so if I were optimistic, I would be saying I'm confident that Israel will survive. That's what optimism means. But the structure of the world is still the structure of the world. It's always been the case that when the Jewish people is being persecuted and killed, everybody else, all of the non-Jews, are becoming slaves. That has always been true. It's been true for 2,500 years. No exceptions. Not even one. Every time the Jews are being persecuted and killed, non-Jews are becoming slaves. Whether you call it the Russian Empire, whether you call it the German Nazis, whether you call it the jihadists, the Inquisition, the ancient Romans, the ancient Greco-Macedonians, it's always the same. Therefore, I'm not going to change that prediction, because all I'm saying is that what always happens will happen again. It's not really a risky prediction. It's the most obvious thing any reasonable scientist should say. You know, if I were to say that the sun will rise tomorrow, I'm not making a radical prediction. And if I say that the Jews are going to be murdered in the 21st century and that Westerners will be enslaved when that happens, that is not a risky prediction either. That's what always happens.
But will it happen?
Well, I'm trying to, like many other people in our generation, like you yourself, because you're interviewing me, we're all trying to change the course of the ship of the West. We're trying to do this, and this has happened before. Good people using critical thinking and thinking really hard about what is ethical and making the decision to be brave and to risk something for the future have changed the course of Western history before. It's very famous. We call it the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was an intellectual process of critical thinking, ethical thinking, that transformed the worldview of the middle and upper classes in the West. And it made possible an alliance with the people below to end the horrors of medieval oppression and begin working towards the construction of modern democratic states where everybody has the same dignity under the law, and everybody's human rights are officially protected, and where the civilizational goal is universal brotherhood. How can we fine-tune and tweak our institutional arrangements so that we can protect more and more people from suffering, right? So that happened. It took a few centuries, but it happened. It required some shedding of blood, of course. There were some revolutions. But we succeeded. I should give credit to our grandparents, our great-grandparents, succeeded in creating a different West. One where the political grammar is an expression of the Judeo-Christian ethics that we inherited, well, obviously first from the Jews, and the Jews from the ancient Babylonian Semites. So I think we can do this again, because we've done it before. We can do it again. And so, and we have amazing tools of communication that we didn't have before that make it possible for you to interview me, and a few days later, several 100,000 people may have seen it. We know this can happen because it has happened before with you and me. And that means we instantaneously reach a lot of people that with earlier technologies we could have never done. And much of what is learned can be processed because, as you said, this becomes like a mini class, right? It's a very pedagogical medium. It's very pedagogical. So I like what Jordan Peterson has said about the importance of video and sharing videos and so forth. He said many profound things. I think he's right. I think the podcast revolution is a real revolution in communications. And for that reason, it's also a political revolution because it allows voices that would have been censored to express themselves and have an effect and to rise in popularity through the strength of the quality of their arguments in open debate, open and public debate. So this is an amazing world we're living in. Of course, they're trying to take these technologies away from us or to make them useless. That's going on. But we should keep trying to run circles around them and work as fast as we can while we still have them. And we can win. Look, 70% of the U.S. population in the latest poll I saw is supporting Israel. So clearly Americans are resisting all of this propaganda. And Americans are a very important people. If Americans can resist, others can resist too. We will draw inspiration from the Americans. I've always admired the American instinct for freedom and for free speech. It's very strong in the United States, and free speech is the very cornerstone of all freedom. And Americans do understand this. People in other countries don't, but Americans understand this. So I think the big fight for freedom of speech may be won in the United States, thanks to the American spirit. We will see, but I think it may be won. And if that happens, we can win everything.
That's a prediction I can subscribe to, Francisco.
Well, we have to end on an optimistic note.
We have to, because yes, I mean, it's an essential part of it, and it has happened before, and it can happen again. And I'm hoping that we can have as many interviews and conversations as possible for this to just rise to the collective consciousness, saying that there is a way out, a proper way out. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't shy away from speaking hard truths, that you're the first one to say them and in this platform. So, Francisco, thank you for joining me for another one, and we'll see each other again soon. I'm sure of it.
Well, it's a great pleasure. Thank you for having me, Alex.